The Midnight File, the Mexican Hannibal Lecter, Fantasur, a 60-minute script by Julian Cross. Some men wear their darkness like a second skin. Others hide it beneath white coats and gold watches, behind surgical precision and charitable smiles. This is the story of a man who did both, a physician who saved lives and took them with equal skill, whose elegance concealed something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. And decades later, his story would inspire one of fiction's most terrifying villains. But before we begin, I need to ask you something. This is The Midnight File, and we're building something different here. A place for stories that refuse to let go, cases that linger in the corners of your mind long after the telling is done. We're trying to reach our first 100 subscribers, and I'm asking you to be part of that foundation. If you're drawn to mysteries that blur the line between solved and unsolved, between justice and ambiguity, then subscribe now, help us get there. And if this story moves you, if it makes you think or question or wonder, leave us a like. We're aiming for 50 likes on this episode, 50 people who understand that some stories deserve to be told, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. This is a true story. Every word of it happened, and that's what makes it so unsettling. The year is 1959, Monterrey, Mexico, a city in the throes of modernization, where old Catholic traditions clash with new aspirations, where appearance matters more than truth, and where secrets are kept behind closed doors with religious fervor. It's a city that prides itself on propriety, on order, on the clean lines between right and wrong. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, something is stirring. A crime wave, the newspapers call it. Bodies discovered along highways, families attacked, a fear settling over the northern city like fog rolling in from the mountains. And in the middle of it all, there's a medical intern, 28 years old, dark red hair, slight build, a man of elegance and composure, from a prominent family, the son of a respected pharmacist. His name is Alfredo Ballí Treviño. And on October 8th, 1959, he commits an act so calculated, so methodical, so clinically precise that it will echo through Mexican criminal history and eventually inspire a character that the entire world would come to know. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start where it truly begins, with a young man walking into a medical office on Articulo 123 Street, unaware that he would never walk out. Jesus Castillo Rangel was 20 years old, a medical student, full of promise and ambition, the kind of young man who represented hope in a conservative society, educated, respectful, from a decent family. But Jesus carried a secret, one that in 1959 Mexico could destroy a life as surely as any weapon. He had been involved with Alfredo Ballí Treviño. The nature of that involvement, whether romantic, passionate, or something more complicated, remains shrouded in the kind of ambiguity that families prefer and newspapers sensationalize. What we know is this: there was a relationship, and that relationship was about to end in the most horrific way imaginable. The accounts conflict on the motive. Some say it was money, a financial dispute between student and intern, a debt unpaid or a betrayal of trust. Others whisper a different story, that Jesus wanted to end their relationship, that he'd grown tired or afraid or both, that he'd decided to walk away from whatever they'd shared in the shadows. Still others suggest that Ballí Treviño, under pressure from his family to marry a woman and maintain the facade of normalcy, had insisted on this arrangement, and Jesus had refused, had opposed it, had perhaps threatened to expose the truth. We'll never know which version is accurate. Perhaps all three contain fragments of truth. Perhaps the motive was something else entirely, something Ballí Treviño took to his grave. What matters is this. On that October evening, Jesus Castillo Rangel walked into Ballí Treviño's medical office in the Talleres neighborhood of Monterrey, and a decision had been made. A line had been crossed in the physician's mind, and what happened next would be executed with the kind of cold precision that separates crimes of passion from acts of calculated destruction. Picture the scene if you can. A medical office, small but well appointed, the smell of antiseptic and alcohol, instruments laid out with surgical care. Ballí Treviño, calm and composed, greeting his visitor with professional courtesy. Did Jesus sense anything wrong? Did some instinct whisper a warning? We'll never know. But what we do know is that Ballí Treviño had prepared. He had thought this through. He had transformed his medical office into something else entirely, a place where life wouldn't be saved but systematically ended. The physician offered Jesus an injection, sodium pentothal, a sedative. Perhaps he claimed it was for anxiety, for stress, for any number of plausible medical reasons. The young man would have trusted him. Why wouldn't he? Ballí Treviño was a doctor, trained and respected. The needle went in, the drug took effect, and Jesus Castillo Rangel slipped into unconsciousness, unaware that he would never wake again. What happened next requires us to confront something deeply disturbing about human capability. Ballí Treviño moved the unconscious body to an adjacent bathroom. He positioned it carefully, and then, with clinical detachment, he drew a blade across Jesus' throat. The young man bled out into the basin, the drain, the tiles. The physician waited, methodical and patient, allowing the body to drain completely. And when the bleeding stopped, the real work began. He retrieved his surgical instruments, scalpels, saws, tools designed for healing, now repurposed for desecration. And over the next hours, because this wasn't something that could be rushed, this required time and precision, Alfredo Ballí Treviño dismembered Jesus Castillo Rangel's body with expertise that bordered on artistic. He would later boast about this, describe it with pride. He had reduced a human being to pieces so small that they fit into a single cardboard box, and he had done it without touching a single bone. Without a single cut that wasn't deliberate, controlled, exact. Think about what that means. The level of anatomical knowledge required, the steadiness of hand, the complete absence of emotional response. He wasn't raging or panicking or lost in the frenzy of violence. He was working, focused, perhaps even satisfied with his own technical mastery. This wasn't the act of a man who'd lost control. This was the act of a man who had complete control, who had reduced another human being to a problem to be solved, a body to be processed, tissue and bone and blood to be managed with clinical efficiency. When he finished, he cleaned his instruments. He packaged the remains in that cardboard box, sealed it carefully, and then he loaded it into the trunk of his automobile and drove out of the city, into the darkness, toward a remote location called Rancho La Noria in the municipality of Guadalupe. He wasn't alone for this part. He'd enlisted a farmhand, someone he paid to help dig a hole to help bury the box. And what did he tell this worker? That it was medical waste, hospital materials. Nothing to be concerned about. Just another task, another job, another hole in the ground. The farmhand helped bury the box and took his payment and went home. And Alfredo Ballí Treviño returned to Monterrey, to his medical practice, to his life of routine and respectability. Perhaps he believed that would be the end of it, that the earth would keep his secret, that the box would decompose, the remains would scatter, and Jesus Castillo Rangel would simply become another missing person, another name on a list of the disappeared, another unsolved mystery in a city full of them. But secrets, like bodies, have a way of surfacing. If you're still watching, if this story has hooked you the way it hooked me when I first opened this file, then do me a favor. Share this video with someone. Send it to a friend who loves true crime, who appreciates storytelling that goes deeper than headlines. Because channels like this, channels that take time, that care about getting the details right, that treat these stories with the gravity they deserve, we only survive if people like you spread the word. Share it. Let others discover the Midnight File. Now, let's talk about how everything unraveled. Within days, not weeks, not months, but days, another worker at Rancho La Noria noticed something disturbing. Perhaps it was the smell. Perhaps it was the way the earth had been turned, the suspicious freshness of disturbed soil. Perhaps it was simply instinct, that primal recognition that something is wrong, something is buried that shouldn't be. This worker, whose name has been lost to history, alerted the authorities. And when the police arrived and began to excavate, when they opened that cardboard box and discovered what was inside, pieces of a human being, carefully dismembered, methodically packed, the investigation turned immediately to the person who'd arranged the burial, the farmhand. And the farmhand, faced with police questioning, gave them a name, Dr. Alfredo Ballí Treviño. The detectives moved quickly. They didn't storm his office with uniforms and sirens. They were smarter than that. They approached his medical practice on Articulo 123 Street, disguised as patients. They walked through the door, presented symptoms, waited to be seen, and when Ballí Treviño called them back to the examination room, when he closed the door and turned to face them with his professional courtesy and calm demeanor, they revealed their true identities. "You are under arrest for the death of Jesus Castillo Rangel." Imagine that moment, the physician standing in his own office, surrounded by the instruments of his trade, faced with the truth he must have known would eventually arrive. Did his composure crack? Did fear flash across his face? According to the reports, he did something unexpected. He tried to bribe them. Right there, in that moment, he offered each detective a new automobile and access to his father's pharmacy. Not a small bribe, not a desperate handful of cash. He offered them wealth, security, the kind of payoff that could change their lives. The officers declined. They arrested him. They brought him to the station. And then Alfredo Ballí Treviño did something that would define the rest of his story, something that would make him infamous beyond the crime itself. He confessed, immediately, without torture, without extended interrogation, without legal maneuvering. He sat down and told them everything, and he didn't tell it with remorse or horror or shame. He told it with pride. He described the injection of sodium pentothal, the precision of the cut, the careful positioning of the body. He walked them through the dismemberment process, explaining his technique, his methodology, his surgical decisions. He bragged about not touching a single bone, about reducing a human being to pieces so small they fit in a box that could be carried by two men. He spoke like a craftsman discussing his work, like an artist explaining his process. There was no sense of guilt in his confession, only a kind of cold satisfaction, as though he'd been waiting to tell someone, as though he'd been proud of his technical achievement and frustrated that no one could appreciate it. The detectives must have been disturbed, not just by what he'd done, but by how he discussed it. This wasn't a man broken by conscience or haunted by his actions. This was a man who saw himself as skilled, efficient, successful. He had committed the perfect technical execution. The only mistake had been the burial, too careless, too obvious, too trusting of others. But the crime itself, he seemed to view it as a triumph of precision and control. The news spread through Monterrey like fire through dry brush. A respected physician's son, an educated man, a medical professional. And what he had done, the calculated nature of it, the surgical precision, the complete absence of conventional morality, it terrified the conservative city in a way that random violence never could. Random violence can be attributed to passion, to madness, to circumstances beyond control. But this was intelligence turned toward destruction. This was knowledge weaponized. This was someone who understood life so thoroughly that he could systematically disassemble it without hesitation. And there was another element, one that the newspapers seized upon with a mixture of scandal and moral outrage. The relationship between Ballí Treviño and his victim had been sentimental in nature. In 1959, Mexico, in deeply Catholic Monterrey, this added a layer of transgression that went beyond the act itself. It wasn't just the taking of life that scandalized society. It was the suggestion of a relationship between two men, the implication of desires that conservative culture demanded remain hidden, unnamed, denied. The press sensationalized this aspect mercilessly. Ballí Treviño became not just a criminal, but a symbol of moral corruption, of deviance, of everything that respectable society feared and condemned. His trial began in May of 1961. The prosecution presented the evidence, the confession, the remains, the testimony of the farmhand, the forensic examination that confirmed the surgical nature of the dismemberment. The defense had little to work with. How do you defend a man who has proudly confessed to such calculated violence? How do you appeal to sympathy when he shows none himself? The verdict was inevitable. Alfredo Ballí Treviño was convicted on 3 charges: homicidio calificado, qualified homicide, the most serious form under Mexican law, clandestine burial for hiding the remains, and unlawfully practicing medicine against Jesus Castillo Rangel, a charge that acknowledged he had used his medical training as a weapon, that he had violated the fundamental oath of his profession. and the sentence handed down was historic: death by execution. He became the last Mexican citizen to receive a capital sentence before the country effectively abolished the death penalty. Think about that. The severity with which Mexican authorities viewed his crime in that era, the judgment that this man represented such a danger, such a violation of fundamental human values, that he deserved the ultimate punishment. He was transferred to Topo Chico prison in Nuevo León, a facility feared throughout the state for its lawlessness and violence, and there, in that brutal environment, Alfredo Ballí Treviño's story should have ended. He should have been executed, or perhaps lived out his days in confinement, another forgotten name in the annals of Mexican criminal justice. But that's not what happened, and this is where the story becomes something else entirely, where the questions multiply, where ambiguity replaces certainty, where we enter territory that remains disputed and unresolved to this day. Before we continue, I want you to do something. Look at the like button below this video. If this story is affecting you, if you're invested in where this is going, if you're questioning things you thought you knew about justice and redemption and human nature, then click that button. We're trying to reach 50 likes on this episode. 50 people who believe that stories like this matter, that complexity deserves attention, that the truth is never as simple as we'd like it to be. Click like. And then let's talk about what happened to Alfredo Ballí Treviño in Topo Chico prison, because it wasn't what anyone expected. The year is 1963. 4 years after the crime, 2 years after the conviction and death sentence. In a Texas prison, an American named Dykes Askew Simmons sits on death row for his own horrific crime, the October 1959 execution of 3 siblings, Hilda, Martha, and Manuel Perez Villagomez, attacked on a roadside in what investigators believe was a random act of violence. Simmons has been extradited to Mexico and now awaits his fate in Topo Chico prison, the same facility where Ballí Treviño is imprisoned. Enter Thomas Harris, 23 years old, an aspiring writer working as a journalist for Argosy magazine. He's been assigned to interview Simmons to get the story of the American on death row in a Mexican prison. Harris travels to Monterrey with his notepad and his questions and his young writer's curiosity about the dark corners of human nature. He arrives at Topo Chico, that forbidding institution where violence and desperation permeate every stone, and requests his interview with Dykes Askew Simmons. But before he can meet Simmons, something unexpected happens. Harris is directed to the prison medical office. There's been an incident, the guards explain. Simmons was shot during an escape attempt. He'd tried to bribe a guard who took his money and then betrayed him, shooting him rather than facilitating his escape. Someone performed emergency surgery, stopped the bleeding, saved his life. If Harris wants to interview Simmons, he needs to understand the medical situation first. He needs to speak with the prison doctor. So Thomas Harris walks into that medical office, and he meets a man who will change his life, though he doesn't know it yet. A man the other prisoners and some staff call Dr. Salazar. Small build, dark red hair, elegant bearing. There's something about him, a stillness, a composure, a way of occupying space that suggests control and intelligence. He stands very still when Harris enters, and there's a certain elegance about him, a quality that seems out of place in the brutal confines of Topo Chico. They begin to talk. Harris asks about Simmons's medical condition, about the surgery that saved his life, but Dr. Salazar seems more interested in asking questions than answering them. He wants to know about Simmons's psychology, his motivations, his history. He probes Harris with questions about trauma, about childhood development, about how physical defects might shape psychological formation. Simmons, Harris explains, was born with a cleft lip, a facial deformity that would have marked him as different, as flawed, that might have generated shame or anger or a sense of being judged. And Dr. Salazar listens with intense focus, processing this information with the kind of analytical precision that suggests deep understanding of human psychology. He discusses behavioral patterns, the connection between childhood trauma and adult violence, the ways that perceived deformity can fracture a person's relationship with society. Harris is impressed. This prison doctor seems remarkably sophisticated, unusually insightful. His questions reveal an understanding of human nature that goes beyond medical training, that touches on something deeper and more disturbing, an ability to see into the mechanisms of violence, to understand what drives people to do terrible things. The conversation ends. Harris conducts his interview with Simmons. He gathers his material, prepares to leave. But before he goes, he speaks with the warden, Miguel Guadiana Barra. And almost as an afterthought, Harris mentions the prison doctor, that Dr. Salazar. Quite impressive. Very insightful. The warden's face changes. He looks at Harris with something between surprise and dark amusement. Dr. Salazar isn't an employee, the warden explains. He's a prisoner, a convicted individual sentenced to death for homicide. He'll never leave this place. And there's more? The warden leans in, his voice dropping. As a surgeon, this man possessed a chilling skill. He packaged his victim in a surprisingly small box. The precision required, the anatomical knowledge, the complete detachment necessary to reduce a human being to parts that could be contained and hidden. That's who you were speaking with, Mr. Harris. That's who saved Simmons's life. A man sentenced to die for doing the opposite. Thomas Harris leaves Topo Chico that day with something lodged in his mind, something he can't quite shake. The image of that elegant, composed man with dark red hair. The stillness, the intelligence, the way he analyzed human psychology with such clinical precision. The disturbing realization that someone capable of such calculated violence could also be charming, insightful, even helpful. That brilliance and monstrosity could exist in the same person, in the same moment, without contradiction. Years pass. Harris continues writing. He works on his craft, develops his voice, explores the darkness that fascinates him, and in 1981, he publishes a novel called Red Dragon. The book introduces a character who will become iconic in popular culture, Dr. Hannibal Lecter, a psychiatrist, brilliant, cultured, elegant, a man who understands human psychology with unsettling clarity, who can see into people's minds and motivations with surgical precision. And yes, a man who has also committed acts of terrible violence, who has dismembered victims with methodical skill, who represents the terrifying convergence of intelligence and inhumanity. The parallels are unmistakable, the elegance, the psychological sophistication, the medical background, the ability to charm and manipulate, the clinical detachment from conventional morality. Thomas Harris has taken his 1963 encounter in Topo Chico prison and transformed it into fiction. Dr. Salazar, Alfredo Ballí Treviño, has become Dr. Hannibal Lecter. The Mexican physician condemned to death has inspired one of literature's most memorable villains. But here's what makes this connection so fascinating, so layered with irony. While Thomas Harris was creating Hannibal Lecter, while he was writing Red Dragon in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Alfredo Ballí Treviño was preparing to leave Topo Chico. His death sentence had been commuted. The exact timeline remains murky. Different sources cite different dates, ranging from 1970 to potentially earlier, but the result is undisputed. The man sentenced to execution served approximately 20 years and was released around 1980 or 1981. Right around the time Red Dragon was published, right around the time Hannibal Lecter entered the cultural consciousness, the real-life inspiration walking free, while his fictional counterpart terrorized readers from behind prison bars. The timing is either remarkable coincidence or evidence of something more complex, something that raises uncomfortable questions about justice, about privilege, about what happens when the powerful are convicted of terrible crimes. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Was Ballí Treviño's release simply the result of Mexico abolishing capital punishment, a bureaucratic correction applied equally to all death row inmates? Or was there something else at work? Political connections, family influence, the kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that allows certain people to escape the full consequences of their actions? I want to hear your theories. I want to know what you think happened in those prison corridors and government offices that resulted in a man like Alfredo Ballí Treviño regaining his freedom after serving only 2 decades for a crime that should have ended his life. Because what happened next is even stranger. Ballí Treviño returned to Monterrey, to the same neighborhood where he'd committed his crime, to Talleres, where Jesus Castillo Rangel had walked into a medical office and never walked out. And he resumed his medical practice, the same profession, the same city, the same streets, as though 20 years in prison had been merely an interruption, an inconvenience, something to be gotten past so life could continue as before. He established a modest clinic. He treated the poor and the elderly. He charged nothing or next to nothing, providing care to those who couldn't afford proper medical attention. By all accounts, he lived quietly. He stayed out of public view. He didn't draw attention to himself or parade his freedom or make any public statements about his past. He simply practiced medicine day after day, year after year, serving the same impoverished colonia where he had once taken a life. People who knew him during this period describe him as competent, even compassionate. Elderly patients praised his skill and his willingness to help, regardless of their ability to pay. He became, in some ways, a fixture of the community, a doctor who served those the system had forgotten, who provided care where it was needed most. Some would call this redemption, others would call it performance, a carefully constructed facade designed to rehabilitate his image and allow him to live in relative peace. The truth? We'll never know which interpretation is accurate. Perhaps both contain elements of validity. Perhaps human beings are too complex to be reduced to simple narratives of evil or good, guilt or redemption. But let's talk about something that has never been fully addressed, something that haunts this case like a shadow that never quite materializes into substance: the hitchhiker fatalities. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, bodies were discovered along highways near Monterrey. Individuals who'd been picked up while hitchhiking, then slain and dismembered. The pattern was disturbing. Careful dismemberment, remains packed into containers, disposal along roadways. The methodology bore a striking resemblance to what Alfredo Ballí Treviño had done to Jesus Castillo Rangel. Some sources suggest he was suspected in as many as 20 such cases. 20 young people who made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride from someone they trusted, someone who presented himself as respectable and helpful, someone who then turned that trust into an opportunity for violence. But here's the problem. Suspicion isn't proof. The cases were never definitively linked to Ballí Treviño. No forensic evidence connected him to those highway victims. No witnesses placed him at the scenes. No confessions emerged, even during his cooperative phase after arrest. So we're left with questions that have no satisfactory answers. Was Alfredo Ballí Treviño a serial perpetrator who simply wasn't caught for most of his crimes, who managed to evade justice for the majority of his victims because forensic science in 1950s Mexico wasn't sophisticated enough to make the connections? Or was he simply a convenient suspect, someone whose known crime made him an easy target for speculation, allowing investigators to potentially close unsolved cases by suggesting a connection that never truly existed? The ambiguity is maddening, because if he was responsible for those highway deaths, then his 20-year sentence becomes even more grotesque, a man who took dozens of lives serving less time than many serve for a single offense. And if he wasn't responsible, if he was only guilty of Castillo Rangel's end, then we've potentially slandered him by association with crimes he didn't commit, adding fictional atrocities to real ones. Either way, the truth remains buried somewhere between official records and whispered speculation. And there's another layer to this mystery, one that involves Thomas Harris himself. After Red Dragon became successful, after The Silence of the Lambs in 1988 turned Hannibal Lecter into a cultural phenomenon, Harris wanted to confirm the details of his 1963 encounter. He reached out to Diego Enrique Osorno, a Mexican journalist and author who had investigated the Ballí Treviño case extensively. Osorno provided Harris with confirmation: yes, Dr. Salazar was indeed Alfredo Ballí Treviño. Yes, the details matched. Yes, the real-life physician had inspired the fictional monster. Harris eventually acknowledged this publicly. When a new edition of The Silence of the Lambs was published, Harris wrote a prologue explicitly crediting Alfredo Ballí Treviño as the inspiration for Dr. Hannibal Lecter. The connection became part of literary history, discussed in interviews and documentaries, analyzed by fans and scholars alike. Hannibal Lecter, one of fiction's most recognizable villains, had a real-life origin story. The elegance, the intelligence, the psychological sophistication, the surgical precision, all of it drawn from a chance encounter in a Mexican prison between a young writer and an imprisoned physician. But here's what's fascinating. There's no evidence that Alfredo Ballí Treviño ever publicly acknowledged this connection. After The Silence of the Lambs became a global phenomenon in 1991, after Anthony Hopkins won an Oscar for his portrayal of Lecter, after the character became embedded in popular culture, Ballí Treviño said nothing. He didn't give interviews about it. He didn't claim credit or express outrage. He simply remained silent, continuing his quiet medical practice in Monterrey, as though none of it had anything to do with him. Was he aware? Almost certainly. By the early 1990s, The Silence of the Lambs was everywhere. Books, films, cultural commentary. Someone in his circle must have mentioned it. Someone must have made the connection. But Ballí Treviño chose silence. Perhaps he was ashamed. Perhaps he was strategic, understanding that drawing attention to his past would undermine his carefully constructed present. Perhaps he simply didn't care, viewing his fictional counterpart as irrelevant to his actual life. We'll never know. The years continued. 1981 became 1990. 1990 became 2000. Ballí Treviño aged. His health declined. He developed prostate cancer, the disease progressing slowly but inevitably. A spinal injury left him in a wheelchair. The elegant man who had once stood so still, who had possessed such physical control, became limited in movement, dependent on others for basic mobility. And as the 2000s progressed, as he approached his 80s, a journalist decided to try something that no one had successfully done in decades: get Alfredo Ballí Treviño to talk about his past. Juan Carlos Rodriguez worked for Milenio, a Monterrey newspaper. In December 2008, he reached out to the elderly physician and requested an interview. Remarkably, Ballí Treviño agreed. At 81 years old, confined to a wheelchair, dying from cancer, he consented to speak with a journalist. But he set a condition. He would discuss anything Rodriguez wanted to know: his life, his medical practice, his thoughts on medicine or society, or whatever topics the journalist found interesting. Anything except one thing: the crime, the past. What had happened on Articulo 123 Street in October of 1959. Rodriguez, to his credit, tried anyway. He broached the subject carefully. He asked questions designed to open the door to that dark history, and Ballí Treviño shut it down immediately. His words are worth quoting directly. "If you want, we can talk about anything you'd like except for that. I don't want to relive my dark past. I don't want to wake up my ghosts. It's very hard. The past is heavy. And the truth is that this angst I have is unbearable. I can't live with it." Read those words again, feel the weight of them. This wasn't denial. This wasn't a claim of innocence or an attempt to rewrite history. This was acknowledgement without engagement. He called it his dark past. He referred to ghosts. He admitted to carrying unbearable angst. He knew what he'd done. He lived with it. But he refused to discuss it, refused to let it become part of his present consciousness, refused to drag those memories into the light of day. The interview continued on other topics. Ballí Treviño expressed uncertainty about basic facts of his own life: how long he'd practiced medicine, specific details of his years after prison. He mentioned that life after release had been difficult initially, but had improved over time. He spoke of depression that descended on certain days, a heaviness that wouldn't lift. And when pressed about remorse, about whether he felt guilt for what he'd done, he reportedly said, "I paid what I had to pay, now I only hope for divine punishment." Think about that statement: "I paid what I had to pay." 20 years in Topo Chico, that was his payment, and in his mind that settled the earthly debt. Whatever judgment remained would come from a higher authority, from divine punishment that he now awaited with the resignation of a dying man who knows he can't escape the final reckoning. It's not quite an expression of remorse, it's not quite an evasion, it's something in between, an acknowledgement of guilt combined with a claim that earthly justice has been satisfied, that whatever comes next is beyond human jurisdiction. 2 months later, in February 2009, Alfredo Ballí Treviño died in his sleep. Prostate cancer. He was 81 years old. The man who had inspired Hannibal Lecter, who had become a symbol of calculated violence and disturbing intelligence, who had served 20 years for an act of brutal precision and then lived nearly 3 more decades in apparent respectability, he was gone. And with him went the answers to so many questions that no one had been able to ask, or that he had refused to answer. If this story has stayed with you, if you're still thinking about it, still turning it over in your mind, then I'm going to ask you one more time. Subscribe to the Midnight File. Hit that button below. Because we're building something here, a collection of stories that refuse to be simple, cases that challenge our assumptions about justice and morality and human nature. We need to reach that first 100 subscribers, and you can help make that happen. Subscribe now, and if you haven't liked the video yet, do it. We're so close to 50 likes. Let's get there together. Now let's talk about what makes this case truly unresolved, truly ambiguous, truly haunting. Because on the surface it seems solved, doesn't it? A crime was committed, a perpetrator was identified, he confessed, he was convicted. He served time. He died. That's closure, right? That's justice, however imperfect. But look closer and the questions multiply like cracks spreading through ice. First, there's the question of the highway victims. We'll probably never know the truth. The forensic evidence doesn't exist anymore. The witnesses, if there were any, are gone. The investigators have retired or passed away. Alfredo Ballí Treviño took whatever knowledge he had to the grave. If he was responsible for those 20 suspected cases, then he quite literally got away with it, served a fraction of the time his true body count would have warranted. And if he wasn't responsible, if those were separate crimes committed by different individuals, then we've perhaps unfairly added to his legend, made him more monstrous than reality justified. Either way, the truth is gone. Second, there's the question of motive. Why did he take Jesus Castillo Rangel's life that October evening? Was it money? Was it romantic rejection? Was it resentment over pressure to marry? The sources conflict, the facts are murky. And Ballí Treviño, who confessed so freely to the mechanics of the crime, apparently never clarified why he did it. He explained how with pride and precision. He never explained why. That silence suggests something important. Perhaps the motive was so personal, so tied to aspects of himself he couldn't acknowledge, that speaking it aloud was impossible even when confession of the act itself came easily. Third, there's the troubling question of his release and the years that followed. How does a man sentenced to death serve only 20 years? Yes, Mexico was moving away from capital punishment. Yes, other death sentences were commuted. But Ballí Treviño didn't just survive. He thrived. He returned to practicing medicine in the very neighborhood where he'd committed his crime. He faced no apparent professional restrictions, no monitoring, no ongoing scrutiny. He simply resumed his life as though the previous 2 decades had been an unfortunate but surmountable obstacle. Was this evidence of a justice system that believes in rehabilitation and second chances? Or was it evidence of something else? Family connections, political protection, the kind of invisible privileges that smooth the path for certain people while others remain trapped by far lesser offenses. The sources hint at this possibility, but provide no concrete evidence. Ballí Treviño came from a prominent family. His father owned a pharmacy. They had resources, connections, social capital. In the Mexico of that era, such things mattered enormously. They could mean the difference between execution and commutation, between life imprisonment and release, between being barred from your profession and being allowed to practice again. But we have no smoking gun, no documented bribes or political interventions, just the uncomfortable fact of his trajectory and the questions it raises about equality before the law. Fourth, there's the redemption question, perhaps the most philosophically complex of all. Did Alfredo Ballí Treviño genuinely transform during his 2 decades in prison? Did he emerge as a changed man, someone who had confronted his darkness and chosen a different path? The evidence could support this interpretation. He spent nearly 30 years treating the poor without adequate compensation. He helped people who had no other options. Patients praised him. He caused no further documented harm. By any conventional measure of rehabilitation, he succeeded. He reintegrated into society. He contributed positively. He lived quietly and without incident until his death. But can we ever truly separate sincere transformation from strategic performance? Can we know whether his charitable medical work came from genuine remorse and desire to atone, or from a calculated understanding that this was the best way to rehabilitate his image and live peacefully? Both interpretations fit the facts. Both are psychologically plausible. And Ballí Treviño himself, who refused to discuss his past even on his deathbed, provided no clarity. He took his true motivations with him. And then there's the haunting reality that his most enduring legacy has nothing to do with his actual crime or his years of service afterward. His legacy is Hannibal Lecter, a fictional character, a cultural icon that has transcended its literary origins to become a symbol of brilliant, elegant evil. Millions of people around the world know Hannibal Lecter. They've watched the films, read the books, quoted the lines, "I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti." They know the image of Anthony Hopkins behind the glass, the restraint mask, the penetrating stare. They know the character's sophistication, his cultural refinement, his disturbing combination of civility and savagery. But how many of those millions know about Alfredo Ballí Treviño? How many have heard of the real physician in a Mexican prison who inspired the fiction? How many understand that behind the literary creation was an actual human being who actually committed an act of calculated violence, who actually dismembered someone with surgical precision, who actually spoke with pride about his technical mastery? The fictional monster has eclipsed the real one, which is perhaps the strangest form of justice or injustice, depending on how you look at it. Thomas Harris gave Ballí Treviño a kind of immortality, but it's an immortality through translation, through transformation into something both more and less than the truth. Hannibal Lecter is more theatrical, more consistently monstrous, more explicitly evil than the real Alfredo Ballí Treviño seems to have been. But Lecter is also less ambiguous, less complicated, less troublingly human. We can watch Hannibal Lecter on screen and feel safely distanced from him. He's a gothic villain, a nightmare figure, someone clearly delineated as other. We don't have to confront the uncomfortable possibility that someone capable of such calculated violence could also be elegant, helpful, socially functional, even in some ways admirable. But Alfredo Ballí Treviño forces us to confront exactly that. He wasn't a slavering maniac. He wasn't deranged or obviously evil. He was intelligent, composed, sophisticated. He inspired Thomas Harris, not through obvious monstrosity, but through unsettling elegance. He saved Dykes Askew Simmons's life in prison. He treated impoverished patients for decades. He maintained relationships, lived in society, functioned as a respected member of his community despite his past. He was, in other words, disturbingly normal, or capable of appearing normal, which amounts to the same thing in practical terms, and that's what makes this case so unsettling. Not the violence itself, horrible as it was, not the dismemberment or the pride in technical skill, disturbing as those elements are. What makes it truly unsettling is the reminder that human beings are capable of containing contradictions that our moral frameworks struggle to accommodate. That someone can be both compassionate and monstrous. That intelligence and culture are no barrier to calculated violence. That the person who saves lives today might have taken them yesterday, and we have no reliable way to distinguish sincere transformation from effective performance. The conservative society of 1950s Monterrey tried to make sense of Ballí Treviño by focusing on the aspects they found most scandalous: the relationship between two men, the violation of sexual norms, the transgression against Catholic morality. They made it about deviance, about corruption, about sins against nature and propriety. But that framing, while revealing about that era's prejudices, ultimately obscured more than it illuminated. The real story wasn't about sexuality or moral corruption in that conventional sense. It was about something more fundamental and more disturbing: the capacity for calculated violence that can exist alongside apparent normalcy. The way someone can dismember another human being with surgical precision on Tuesday and return to routine professional duties on Wednesday without any external sign of internal struggle. When Juan Carlos Rodriguez tried to get Ballí Treviño to discuss this in 2008, the elderly physician refused. "I don't want to wake up my ghosts." That phrase haunts me. Because it suggests that the ghosts were still there, even after nearly 50 years, that he carried them, that they weren't exorcised by punishment or by decades of subsequent service or by the passage of time. They were just sleeping, or perhaps merely suppressed, held at bay by conscious choice and daily discipline, and he feared what would happen if he allowed them to wake, if he opened that door and let those memories flood back into consciousness. "The past is heavy," he said. "This angst I have is unbearable. I can't live with it." So he didn't live with it. He refused to engage with it. He kept it locked away, refused to discuss it, maintained his silence until death. Was this avoidance? Probably. Was it also a form of ongoing punishment, carrying that unbearable weight without relief of confession or absolution? Perhaps. We don't get to know. Ballí Treviño maintained control over his narrative in the only way left available to him in those final years, through silence, through refusal, through simply declining to provide the answers that everyone wanted. And so we're left with a story that resists simple conclusions, a crime that was solved in the legal sense but remains shrouded in ambiguity in almost every other sense. We know what Alfredo Ballí Treviño did to Jesus Castillo Rangel. We have his confession, the forensic evidence, the conviction, but we don't know why he did it. We don't know if he did it to others. We don't know how he secured his release, or what mechanisms of privilege or institutional failure allowed him to return to medical practice. We don't know whether his subsequent decades of service constituted genuine redemption or calculated rehabilitation of image. We don't know what truly haunted him in his final years, what those ghosts looked like when they visited him in the darkness of sleepless nights, and perhaps most troubling of all, we don't know what lessons we're supposed to draw from this story. Should we view the justice system's handling of his case as a success? A man who served his time, reintegrated successfully, and contributed positively to society for decades? Or should we view it as a failure? A man who possibly escaped full accountability, who may have committed additional crimes that went unpunished, who perhaps exploited privilege and connections to avoid the full consequences of calculated violence. Both interpretations have merit. Both make sense of different aspects of the story. Neither can be definitively proven or disproven. What I can tell you is this: Alfredo Ballí Treviño existed. He lived for 81 years. He committed at least one act of calculated, methodical violence. He spent 20 years in prison. He practiced medicine for decades afterward. He inspired one of fiction's most memorable villains. And he died quietly in 2009, leaving behind more questions than answers, more ambiguity than clarity. The Midnight File specializes in cases like this, stories where the legal conclusion doesn't provide emotional or philosophical closure, where the facts are known, but their meaning remains contested, where we're forced to sit with discomfort and uncertainty rather than retreating into simple narratives of good and evil. Because that discomfort, that uncertainty, that complexity, that's where truth actually lives. Not in the clean resolutions we prefer, but in the messy, ambiguous, troubling spaces where human beings actually exist. Jesus Castillo Rangel was 20 years old when he died. Whatever potential he carried, whatever life he might have lived, whatever contributions he might have made, all of it ended in that medical office on Articular 123 Street. His family lost him. His friends lost him. The world lost whatever he might have become. That's not ambiguous, that's simply tragic. And no amount of complexity or philosophical nuance about Ballí Treviño's subsequent life changes that fundamental fact. So maybe that's the lesson, if there is one. Maybe the point isn't to resolve the ambiguities surrounding Alfredo Ballí Treviño. Maybe the point is to remember Jesus Castillo Rangel, to hold space for that loss, to acknowledge that whatever complicated feelings we might have about justice and rehabilitation and human capacity for change, there's still a young man who died violently and never got to finish his story. And that matters more than any analysis of his perpetrator's psychology or legacy. But I'll leave you with one final thought. Thomas Harris, that young writer who met Dr. Salazar in 1963, created in Hannibal Lecter a character who has terrified and fascinated audiences for decades. And the thing about Lecter that makes him so compelling, so disturbingly memorable, is precisely what made Alfredo Ballí Treviño so unsettling. The combination of elegance and horror, intelligence and monstrosity, charm and calculated violence. We're drawn to that character because he represents something we'd prefer not to acknowledge, that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs, that the most dangerous people might be the most superficially civilized, that we can't always recognize threat when it presents itself with sophistication and culture. Alfredo Ballí Treviño demonstrated that reality in ways that fiction can only approximate. He was real. He existed. He moved through society with apparent normalcy, despite having done something that should mark a person as irredeemably dangerous. And the fact that we still don't fully understand him, that he remains ambiguous and unresolved even after his death, might be the most honest conclusion available. Because some stories don't have endings. They just stop. And we're left with the questions. Thank you for staying with me through this file. If this story affected you, if it made you think or question or see things differently, then share it. Send it to someone, leave a comment with your thoughts. Tell me what you think about Ballí Treviño's release, about redemption, about whether we can ever truly know when someone has changed. And subscribe if you haven't already. The Midnight File exists because people like you believe that complex stories deserve to be told with care and depth and honesty. Help us reach that first 100 subscribers. Help us build something meaningful. Some stories stay with you long after the telling is done. They follow you into the quiet moments, resurface when you least expect them, make you question things you thought you understood. This is one of those stories, and maybe that's appropriate. Maybe Alfredo Ballí Treviño's greatest crime wasn't what he did to Jesus Castillo Rangel, terrible as that was. Maybe his greatest crime was forcing us to confront how little we truly understand about human nature, about justice, about the possibility or impossibility of redemption for those who commit calculated acts of violence. He walked into that prison a condemned man. He walked out 20 years later and resumed his life. He treated the poor. He maintained his elegance. He refused to discuss his past. He inspired a monster who became more famous than he ever was. And he died quietly, taking his secrets with him, leaving us with nothing but questions and the uncomfortable knowledge that we'll never have satisfactory answers. The file closes, but the questions remain, and maybe that's exactly how it should be. Good night, and remember, some files never truly close. They just wait in the darkness, patient and unsolved, for someone willing to open them again. This has been The Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross, and I'll see you in the next case.